When's the last time you voted in a federal election? If it's been more than 2, 4, or maybe even 6 years, should that trigger an automatic process to strike your name from the voter rolls? You can't just walk in and do it. That is the case in Ohio. And if the Supreme Court supports that state, it could become common practice across the country. Alex Miller joins us now. They heard the oral arguments today. Alex Miller, we've told you time and again, is a Supreme Court nerd, and you were there in the room today as they were doing all this. This is a pretty controversial thing because of who it could affect.
Absolutely, and these cases are so specific. We often think of Supreme Court cases answering these big, broad questions. Should gay marriage be legal? Should abortion be practiced? We think about these cases, and like the one that we've heard today, on these big, broad terms, but the reality is there's such a specific question being addressed, even if that decision could have sweeping effects.
Participating in elections is a right, not a requirement. Some people choose to vote every chance they get, others never at all. Those occasional voters are on the voter rolls regardless of how often they cast a ballot. But the state of Ohio says maybe they shouldn't be. The National Voter Registration Act and the Help America Vote Act prohibit a state from removing a voter solely because they fail to vote. See, you're only supposed to be removed from the rolls for 5 specific reasons: at the voter's request, because of a criminal conviction, because of a voter's mental incapacity, death, and moving. Someone who fails to respond to an address confirmation notice and fails to vote in the next 2 regular federal elections can be removed. And that's where the state of Ohio says it's following the law. They say removing people off the voter rolls all comes down to making sure you live where you say you do. And they have a 2-process system to do that. First, if you move and forward a mailing address, the Postal Service will send your name to the Board of Elections. They will then mail you an address confirmation notice. The other, supplemental process, compiles a list of voters who have not engaged in voter activity for 2 years. They get mailed that same notice. In both cases, a voter should fill out the form and send it back. If you don't and choose not to vote for the next 4 years, you're off the rolls. The issue lies with that second, supplemental process. A voter's inactivity triggers the notice, where in the first scenario, just a move does. And that's where the Supreme Court comes in. The 9 justices will have to decide if sending that confirmation notice based on a failure to vote violates the National Voter Registration Act. If it does, thousands of people will be added back on the voter rolls. If not, voters across the state and the country may be purged for throwing that postcard in the trash.
So I spoke with a lawyer who worked against the state. We talked about the broad sweeping ramifications of what these decisions could possibly mean, but we also talked about how this has kind of become a political issue. How does this case have national implications?
Sure. So in a few different ways. First, it arises amid the unmistakable context of state and local efforts to make it harder to vote, to impede the vote, to impede the registration of voter IDs, and we've seen all of these laws across the country. And so I think that's an important context that has to be in the back of the court's mind. It certainly was in the back of our mind writing this brief.
This could set a framework for every state across the country. But Ohio is a battleground state, which is why this case is extremely significant.
The fact that this is happening in a battleground state that has mattered for many recent presidential elections and beyond is not a coincidence. There have been a number of voting rights cases recently, and the ways and the states in which they arise are not a coincidence. And I think this is no exception to that rule, because it could be immensely consequential. I think the number of voters purged here were 7,500, and that can make a huge difference in Cincinnati alone. But if you zoom out and you think, what does that mean for Ohio? What does it mean for other states? This recent election, we've seen just a couple votes in a few counties here or there can make all the difference.
The DOJ is supportive of the state in this case.
They are. And well, that's the other big aspect of this case that's worrisome, which is that until recently the DOJ took a very different interpretation of the National Voter Registration Act, which the whole purpose was to make it easier to vote, to get more people on the rolls. And for 2 decades, under Democratic and Republican administrations alike, they took the interpretation of that law that we do, which is that you shouldn't be able to purge people for voter inactivity alone. Now, all of a sudden, just weeks after the inauguration of President Trump, the Department of Justice had this startling and, to this day, I think really unexplained U-turn. Even in this case, they filed on the side of the voting rights community until it reached to the Supreme Court after the inauguration.
If secretaries of state on both sides of the aisle have supported this process, how can the Democrats now feel a different way?
So I would say 2 things. I think, first of all, if whether a Democratic Republican Democrat Secretary of State or whether a Republican Secretary of State did this, it still violates the National Voter Registration Act. The words are plain. Voter inactivity alone cannot be a basis for purging someone, and that shouldn't matter. Like you said, it's become a partisan issue, but it shouldn't, in a sense.
You know, many of these things look a little different on their face, but some critics or skeptics, like some of the justices, say this is very similar to things like voter ID. You're saying you're helping people vote when in fact it could harm certain people like maybe low income or minorities.
They talked about this specifically during the arguments, even though it's not really technically relevant to the argument itself. Justice Sonia Sotomayor spent quite a long time talking about this, so much so that the Chief Justice, John Roberts, gave some extra time to the state to make their argument. It's usually extremely strict. Like, you got your time and then you are done.
Yeah.
So he gave a couple extra minutes because she was really going into this issue of how the poor and minorities can be disenfranchised because they already have low voter turnout. And if they're kicked off these rolls and then required to reapply, they're most likely not going to do it because they're busy, they're working, they might have thrown this out in the mail, not paid attention. So it's really interesting. It's also interesting the fact that, you know, this is actually, they've billed it as a mailing issue for to see if you've moved locations, and this voting roll issue is kind of secondary to the fact that the state says they're just kind of trying to figure out if you live where you say you do.
What was your sense of the justices' sentiments out of the 9?
It was pretty split. I was talking about it with a couple of other people who were sitting in on the arguments, and nobody really knows. Usually you kind of walk away with an idea. The female justices were extremely hard on the state, and then everybody else kind of went back and forth a little bit. Justice Gorsuch didn't talk and didn't speak, and neither did Thomas.
Another
as
close
usual.
one, maybe a 5-4. All right, thank you so much. I hope you're going to get more sleep tonight than you did last night.
Hopefully a couple more hours.
All right, more with the Y in 2 minutes.